Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all here. Welcome to those of you who are from the Bethel community, and in particular, welcome to those of you who are visiting from off campus. We're really glad you can be here for this Primetime in the Bethel University Library event. Primetime is a series that is a collaboration between the Friends of the Library group, our support group for the library, and other communities within Bethel who have a shared interest in lifelong learning inside and beyond Bethel. And we're so grateful for the support and encouragement from the Friends group this morning. Here's a reminder for our next Primetime event, 48 hours from now. On Thursday, Samuel Campa and Parker Foss will be presenting an international study spotlight about their study abroad experience in Scotland and Oxford with the intriguing title, Amidst Castles and Spires, Studies in St. Andrews and Oxford. Sounds wonderful. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We're happy to share this opportunity to honor some of our students. I'm going to invite my colleague Erlene Warner to step up now, and she is going to introduce this year's Connie Larson Memorial Scholarship winner.
So before we hear the research prize presentation, we would like to announce this other award. In 2009, the Friends of the Library organization established an annual $300 scholarship in memory of Connie J. Larson, reference librarian, in commemoration of her service to the Bethel University Library and in celebration of her dedication to the training, supervision, and development of student library assistants. This scholarship is awarded each year to a student working in the Bethel University Library who exemplifies an attitude of service. And the 2012-2013 recipient of the Connie J. Larson Memorial Scholarship Award is Rachel LaCroix. And today one of Rachel's supervisors would like to share with you some of the reasons why Rachel was nominated and selected.
Hi. Hi. I'm Betty Kranz, and one of Rachel's supervisors in the circulation department. The other supervisor is Nancy Olson, way in the back with the crutches. You'll recognize her. She's kind of gimpy right now. And I've been asked to say a few words about Rachel. I've written them down. Rachel is a good example of a service-oriented circulation student assistant, embodying the caring, peacefulness, and genuine kindness that sincerely lives out her Christian worldview. She has the ability to make people immediately feel at ease and valued, enjoying people of all ages and cultures. She has an effervescence about her that uplifts people's spirits when she talks with them. The library staff noticed these qualities when Rachel's worked here for 2 summers. She's always been an eager participant in library events such as Welcome Week Opportunity Fair, Student Game Night, and our orientation activities, and one of the students instrumental in helping create the library book club for students and staff. Rachel has a willing spirit and does not complain or procrastinate. She does her work wholeheartedly, willing to do any kind of task we ask, even the dirty job of cleaning gum off of tables. Students, that's a no-no. And dusting dirty shelves and books. Her fellow students appreciate the fact that she's often willing to trade or work shifts for them when her busy schedule permits. This does not go unnoticed by her circ mates. She has truly owned her job for the 3 years she has been a library employee and has been a blessing to work with. Rachel will be a wonderful example of a Bethel University graduate as she goes on from here with her graduate studies in audiology. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, I'm Eric Gossett. I'm the president of the Friends of the Bethel University Library, the people who sponsor the library prize and also have raised the money and have sponsored the research prize that we're going to be looking at next. This year the competition was quite stiff. There were quite a number of submissions, and the readers wanted to make an exception from the past and have more than just one prize. And so this year we have first, second, and third prize. The third prize, to third place winner is Joel McDougall, whose senior paper written for Dr. Anna Marie Koistra is entitled, Will the Real Solzhenitsyn Please Stand Up? An American Response to the Works of Alexander Solzhenitsyn from 1953 to 1978. Is Joel here? And the second place winner is Larissa Thune. Her senior seminar paper, again for Dr. Anne Marie Koistra, is entitled The Hutterian Brethren of South Dakota, The Impact of the American Frontier on an Ethnic Religious Immigrant Community, 1874 to 1945. I'm not sure whether Larissa was able to come or not. She is. And this year's first place winner is Ryan Steele. Ryan, if you want to come up. His paper, written for Dr. Samuel Zalanga in Sociocultural Theory, is entitled Utopia or an Iron Cage, Marx, Weber, Nietzsche, and the Future of Modernity. Congratulations. And before he talks, but not much longer before, we have a prize for the department of the winning paper, this marvelous little statue of Dr. Curtis DeYoung, the chair of the Sociocultural Studies Department, Anthro-Socioculture and Reconciliation Studies is down there. You guys get to keep that for the next year. And congratulations to your department.
Thank you. I did it for you. Yeah, I came prepared.
She'll just turn off the
Great. All right, we're good? Great. Well, first off, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank the Friends of the Bethel Library and everyone who had to deal with reading my absurdly long paper. So thank you. This is an honor, and I appreciate being able to present. And I really want to thank the DASRS, rather than saying the whole department's name again, but the staff and all the support they give me over the years, and especially Dr. Zalanga for leading me through this paper quite a bit. So this was the longest and most in-depth paper I've ever written, and so there's a lot of information, and I'm just going to try to skim the surface to get through this in the time and maybe leave a couple minutes for questions, hopefully. So jump right into it. As complex entities, societies are comprised of the structures and institutions which shape and are shaped by the contextual values and traditions and norms and practices, all of which give individuals within the society a sense of purpose and meaning and identity. And within the last few hundred years in Western society, this has taken form in what we know as modernity. And what's interesting is that modernity has more or less reached a crisis point within the last century or so, especially within the last 50 to 60 years. And while some may say, well, we've already moved on, we're in a postmodern era, I think the average person still greatly experiences reality within modern societal institutions. So it's important then to ask, what is the future of modernity, and what are the implications for those living within it? So quickly, we're just going to give a general definition of modernity, then talk about Weber, Marx, and Nietzsche's perspectives of modernity, talk a little bit about this crisis that I just introduced, and then the three theorists' visions of the future and some possible alternative visions, and then try to bring that all together. So to give you a brief definition of modernity, I go more in depth in this in my paper, and by the way, if you'd like an electronic copy, please let me know. I'd be happy to send you one, and I'd love the feedback. But I guess a general depiction of modern industrial society for the purpose of this paper can be derived whereby industrial capitalism and democratic nation states are coupled with a culture of scientific explanation, universalism, commercialized machine-enhanced production, bureaucratization, and rationalization of all the social institutions. And this is a general tendency toward a more fragmented, commodified, or commercialized and narrowed life experience. Yet at the same time, it's also highly efficient and highly calculable and disciplined. So with this general definition of modernity, I'll move forward and jump right into Karl Marx. And though he's a bit of a controversial figure in the U.S., I think he's a bit misunderstood, and maybe by the end of this paper you may like him a little bit more than the other two. But essentially, to understand Karl Marx's vision of modernity, you kind of have to understand his general view of human nature. And even though he'd hate the idea of having a generalizable human nature, essentially he points to this fact that humans have this innate need for finding and maintaining a sense of meaning and purpose in life. And this is especially manifesting through creative and productive work. And so it's from here that you can see where his development of his materialist conception of history comes into play. And that essentially is the whole of human history can be seen as the struggle of different groups in society to own, control, and dominate the scarce resources of the means of production. In other words, control the economic base of society. And this is where his famous quote at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto societies is the history of class struggle. That's where this kind of comes into play. So for him, modern capitalism is a core element of modernity. And so he praises it for being incredibly productive beyond any other thing in history. Yet at the same time, it's also innately dehumanizing. And this comes into play where he says that private property necessarily results in alienation. And this alienation manifests in the self from the fruits of one's labor. So I put all this work into something, but then it leaves me. It's just a commodity that moves on. And then the self from the self. So as a result of being alienated from my productive work and the fruits of that labor, I'm missing a piece of myself in that. And then the self from others. And that can happen in intra-class relationships, but he really focuses on the inter-class relationships, and that's between, where he talks about the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, the owners of capital and the laborers. And essentially, the bourgeoisie will do everything possible to dominate the economic base of society. So they'll use these societal institutions, what he calls the superstructures, things like government, culture, and religion. They'll use these societal institutions to maintain control over these means of productions, this economic base, as well as placate the oppressed proletariat masses. So for Marx, to move beyond this alienation in modern society, you need to destroy capitalism and abolish private property. Weber, another German social theorist with fantastic facial hair. For him, he says, he greatly wrote in response to Marx in a lot of ways. And so he said, yes, dehumanization is innately a part of modern society, but it's not because of the fight over the economic base. Rather, it's dehumanization due to this rationalization and bureaucratization of life. And so what he says is that modern capitalism's greatest aspect, which is efficiency of production and organization and innovation, this greatest aspect is also its most dehumanizing element. So what he means by rationalization is kind of this ongoing process of making all things incredibly efficient and calculable and thus controllable for humans over nature as well as over others. So for him, modern society is dehumanizing because it leads to this rationalization of all spheres of life, not just in the work and production sphere, but it bleeds into the culture and everyday interactions and daily activities. And so this results in alienation of life for the modern individuals because we begin to confuse the means and the ends. It becomes about production for production's sake rather than production for meeting the common goals and needs of society. And this is where he talks about the problem of meaning. It loses its deeper meaning and purpose in that way. And then he talks about the disenchantment of the world, which is pretty much we have this modern scientific rationalized view of everything, and so we can explain it all away and there's no greater mystery or things bigger than ourselves within that. Friedrich Nietzsche, another fantastically, just the facial hair is wonderful. And so what he says, he greatly influenced Weber, so there's a lot of overlap between the two. But essentially for him, modernity was creating human beings without deep foundations or lasting commitments or convictions. And so it led to this loss of the individual. And he says this ethic of utility, which is the basis of modern society, it destroys the sovereign individual. And for him, the sovereign individual, this strong, leader kind of person was very important for Nietzsche. And so what he said is, with this ethic of utility, there's no space for reflection. Life just becomes this endless checklist of things to do, and you lose that deeper meaning. So, but his biggest scathing critique, I think, of modernity is his rejection, essentially, or major critique of modern scientific worldview. And he says, we create truth according to our own principles and standards that we created. And so what it does is it gets rid of the deeper meaning behind it, and it creates this abyss of meaning when you see the world through this lens. So modern science for him becomes this great destroyer of all ideals and values and purpose. And so for him, then it innately leads to nihilism. There's no greater thing which guides us. It just is this nihilistic tendency. And this is where he comes out and says that the death of the Christian God is the most cardinal event in modern history. And what he means by that, and this is in the parable of the madman in the marketplace, and I'd recommend reading it afterwards. But essentially what he says is that by having this modern scientific worldview, we don't meet God. And so in that way, we strip ourselves of all of our reference points and sense of meaning. There's no, we lose our moral foundations and sense of purpose. And so it leads to this ultimate sense of nothingness, this nihilism. So then, in many ways, Marx, Weber, and Nietzsche all point to the way in which modern values of efficiency and growth and innovation have created a life that is increasingly void of meaning. So I'm going to talk a little bit now, before talking about their future visions, about this crisis of modernity. What does that mean? So the dehumanizing and commodifying nature of this modern capitalist society cannot fully be regulated the way we'd like to think we can. As Weber described, its very nature will lead it to attempt to penetrate into every sphere of life within a particular society. So though you can say that modern society began by using the market as just a means of material exchange, and it may have been bound to just the economic sphere of life, however, as societies and laws evolved, it married this unlimited potential of scientific technological advances, and what Nietzsche would say is this sad, unfulfillable promise of being able to solve all human problems. It marries this idea of scientific technological advances with insatiable desire for material consumption. And so as this occurred, the need for cheaper and cheaper inputs of production resulted in increasingly meaningless and purposeless alienated labor force, which then led the working populace to kind of lose a sense of status except outside of their consumer status. So that becomes their new identity. And this loss of purpose and meaning was left only to be fulfilled by consumption, as Marx would have rightly predicted. And this is the inevitable penetration of this rationalized capitalist system into every sphere of humanity, resulting in the ability to purchase any type of product or service, be it, I don't know, food or gasoline or political influence or sex or whatever it may be. And so when everything can be made into a commodity and given a market value, it can just be so easily exchanged, and it begins to lose its innate human value. It just becomes commodified. And so if this is the case, it seems that there's no aspect of humanity that will not be made into a commodity for market exchange. So thus human beings increasingly become essentially, in a way, prostituted by this market system in every facet of life. For example, so I'm not just speaking out of nowhere, there's already a very well organized international division of labor for the scientific engineering of in vitro babies, whereby the surrogate mother essentially becomes nothing more than a baby producing this machine or an input cost along this production process of babies, which gets sold into the market for the highest bidder. So if something that is so one of the most deeply meaningful things for human beings, giving birth, is made into a bureaucratically organized production process for the market economy, what aspect of humanity is safe from becoming commodified? Is there any aspect of life that is immune? I think if efficiency and profit are the dominant motivations for modern life, are there really any ethical bounds then for which this modern rationalized capitalist market system cannot co-opt? I think even religion has far too often become co-opted by this, and we see, for example, the drive-through churches where literally you pull up, you press a button, the window opens, they say, "What can I pray for you?" They pray for you and you drive off. It's very efficient. It is so very efficient. Yet it seems to lose that deeper meaning behind it, that greater mystery, that sense of purpose. And I think even the family has been co-opted. We look at reality TV where every minute of someone's life is being followed for us to just enjoy and exploit. So the greater question that we must ask as a society is whether or not we want a rationalized market and social system that is able to take almost every aspect of what it means to be human and turn it into a marketable commodity. And if not, the question then becomes, are we too far immersed in this rationalized modern system to go back? Is there even a realistic back to which we would want to return to? Where else then can modern society go? And I think the truly tragic aspect of the modern rationalized life is that it naturally seeks to arrive at some end destination where people have a sense of fulfillment or purpose or success. And as a result, I think the problem, though, is that modern society is a value system driven by this rationalized capitalist market within which there is no clear sense of when one actually has enough. So as a result, modern individuals continue to search for this ultimate solution that will bring them to this utopian point of arrival where their fullest sense of humanity is culminated. unfortunately, the great misconception of the modern rationalized life is that there is no final end-all point of arrival or nirvana or end-all goal. Humanity, in its very essence, derives meaning from the purpose, or from the process and the experience of life. So the modern framework has sought solutions and final destinations when in reality human experience is about the cumulative process. And this is a threat to the modern capitalist system, which prioritizes short-term immediate gratification above long-term lifelong thought and reflection and introspection and growth. In this modern rationalized life, I think immediacy replaces gradualness. The solution replaces the process. And the commodity value replaces the human value of the experience. And so, in short, modern humanity is subjected to an increasingly narrowed and dehumanized and personal, individualistic, self-sufficient, and tragically inconclusive, and thus ultimately meaningless, purposeless, and identityless life, all belied by this unfulfillable promise of modernity. If you're not depressed yet, hold on. So we're going to jump now into what are these three theorist visions of the future of modernity. So Marx's communist utopia. Essentially, I'm not going to go into the technical detail. If you want to read Das Kapital, it takes just a few hours. But essentially, what he says is there's this innate contradiction of capitalism, which is comprised pretty much of the nature of capital within his theory, competition and alienation. But all these things kind of come together in a way that when capitalism begins to mature and advance, it leads to increasing instability. And this is greatly due, amongst other things, to the nature of competition. So as firms compete more and more, there's greater exploitation of the workers. And so they'll work harder at longer hours for less wages, and then you begin to see the bourgeoisie begin to buy each other out with all these mergers. But essentially, as the exploitation and their misery increases, the proletariat will come to the sense of class consciousness, where they realize, as Marx said, that by destroying capitalism, all they have left to lose is their chains. So then they'll overthrow this bourgeoisie and essentially abolish capitalism and private property and institute communal ownership of the means of production. So essentially, they'll redirect. This is based off of advanced technology from capitalism, and they'll redirect this technology and production towards meeting the goals and needs of society, rather. So in that way, people don't need to work as much. They can enjoy more leisure, because where people used to focus so much of production time for just profit's sake, now it's redirected for the common good. And then we'll have more meaningful work and more meaningful leisure and more variety and creativity, because we can move from one job to the next on any given day, or what satisfies our talents the most, or our creativity, because of advanced technology we can move. So he says, and this is paraphrasing, but essentially, you can fish in the morning, you can work in the factory line in the afternoon, and read Plato at night without ever becoming a fisherman or an industrial worker or a philosopher. So that's kind of his communist utopia. Weber's iron cage. I think Weber's incredibly misunderstood by especially American Christians. They think of, oh, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Yeah. And then they don't actually read it, because I think if they did, they wouldn't like him as much. So what he says is that this iron cage idea is the rationalization of all spheres of life. You can't just keep in the economic. It breaks into all things. So it leads to this loss of meaning and purpose and sense of identity, and where we begin to confuse the means and the ends. So production for production's sake, and efficiency for efficiency's sake, and never asking what's the greater purpose of this all. So we experience then, in his vision, alienation in both work, within the greater society and culture, and then in our daily activities and relationships. So this iron cage then, for Weber, is this ongoing process. There is no end for it. It's just this ongoing thing where it's inescapable as life becomes increasingly narrowed and specialized and efficient. And the worst part is, for Weber, what he says is that we cannot imagine a new society beyond the walls of this rationalized cage, of this rationalized life. So we become stuck in an endlessly meaningless and purposeless life. Nietzsche, what a character. Amongst other things, Nietzsche says that with modern society, there's this loss of the individual. So we have this continual state of nothingness, essentially. And this is greatly due to the nihilistic nature of modern science and that modern scientific worldview. So he says, we devise these human standards of truth and causality and meaning, essentially the scientific method. And we devise all the principles and terms for evaluating it. And so, but after discovering and explaining all phenomena in the world, we'll eventually seek a deeper purpose and meaning behind it all, and we'll trace it back, and we'll trace it back, and eventually all that's left is those like us, those who created the same principles and framework for discovering the things. There's no greater mystery behind it. And so this is where he says that, he makes the exclamation that God is dead and we are his murderers. And this is because we don't need God anymore within our scientific framework. And even if we did, we can't even reconcile him with the way we see the world now. So what he says is, no, society can't live like this. So you'll be forced to either create new gods or embrace this endless nothingness nature of nihilism. And so he uses this, this metaphor as modernity being this sailing ship. And I want to read this quote, the fantastic mustache again. And so he says this, and you'll recognize he's a bit of a poet. He says, "We have left the land and have gone aboard ship. We have broken down the bridge behind us. Nay, more, the land behind us. Well, little ship, look out. Beside thee is the ocean. It is true it does not always roar, and sometimes it spreads out like silk and gold in a gentle reverie. But times will come when thou wilt feel that it is infinite, and that there is nothing more frightful than infinity. Oh, the poor bird that itself felt free, and now strikes against the walls of this cage. Alas, if homesickness for the land should attack thee, as if there had been more freedom there, and there is no land any longer." So essentially, he paints this image of modernity as this ship that set off, and we destroyed everything behind us because we don't need it anymore within our new framework. And we set off into this ocean. And after traveling for some time, the excitement begins to die down, and we realize there's no land ahead of us. And we've nowhere to go back to. And it's in this moment where we look around and we see nothing but endless water that we have this point of crisis. And this is what Nietzsche says will be the crisis of modernity. So some alternatives. I really wish I could spend more time on this, but I'm just going to quickly talk about it, and I'd love to give you my paper if you'd like. But postmodernism, two big schools of thought, skeptical postmodernism and affirmative postmodernism. I kind of reject skeptical postmodernism because it makes for a good conversation and mental gymnastics, but beyond that has little validity for everyday life. But affirmative postmodernism, however, emphasizes the importance of the local and the community. It's the importance of context, because that's how we experience reality. And they'll say that, yeah, truth is discoverable, yet it's always relative to the context in which you live. And so they also emphasize the importance of prioritizing the experiences and the stories of the marginalized in history. They say we've been dehumanized by not being presented the full picture of history because it only presents the history of the powerful. An example would be like Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. The Arab Spring, Dr. Moore may not be happy with me brushing over this very quickly, but essentially the reasons that I look at this for the paper is it's an image of the rise of non-Western global powers. And I think the Arab Spring shows this mass movement based on grassroots popular struggle for more humanizing political and economic systems. And so what I ask in the question is, can this Arab Spring mentality of struggling, popular struggle for more just structures, can this be maintained and institutionalized? I just read an op-ed article the other day about, is it al-Shatir? Is that his name? The presidential candidate for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt? Okay. And how he'll most likely be elected, and yet he's very pro-neoliberal economic policy. So it seems that maybe it can't be maintained. Feminist alternative. I'm looking at it from the feminist sociological critique, and they say that essentially sociology is built on these principles and frameworks of men. And men are trying to create this disinterested, objective sociologist who observes the other. And they're saying, well, you know what, that's just innately dehumanizing and alienating for those studying as well as those being studied. It just creates abstract theory. It doesn't present how we experience reality. So they say we need to rebuild a sociological framework from lived experiences. And in that way, the sociologists and those being studied, it becomes a dialogue between them. It's about experience and trying to reshape in a way that's more human in that way. Liberation theology. I could talk about this for days, but essentially, getting to the core of it, they'll say that God has always revealed him or herself as the liberator of the oppressed. And so to be a disciple of Christ is to actively fight on the side of the poor and oppressed against unjust, sinful structures. in society. And so for the purpose of this paper, what it does, though, is it marries this religious meaning and purpose with the struggle for creating a just society. Individual coping mechanisms. This comes entirely from George Ritzer's work, The McDonaldization of Society. And essentially he says, yeah, you know what, we can't break free from the iron cage, we're stuck. But, you know, we can do things here and there, like instead of eating at fast food chain restaurants, we can eat at locally owned restaurants. Or instead of staying at big chain, rationalized hotels, we can stay at local bed and breakfast. Just little breaths of air outside of the cage for a moment. So kind of bringing this all together here now. Having presented many of these complexities of life in modern society and some of those predicted visions of the future, I'm going to try to make it all kind of fit together and give a general conclusion, which by its nature has to be open. But despite its incredibly productive, efficient, and innovative nature, the modern capitalist system is innately alienating and dehumanizing, and it will always push towards this tendency, which is described by both Marx and Weber. And although some may say that, yes, capitalism can be reformed to more structurally just and humanizing ways and systems, history seems to reveal that it will either go the complete opposite direction, or it will eventually evolve towards more socially inclined government policies in order to account for these human inadequacies, which both Marx and Weber say this will not solve the problem of human alienation. In fact, Weber says this will lead to even further rationalization of life. However, it is also difficult to fully reject modern capitalism because its very nature will do everything possible to maintain its survival, particularly with the support of the powerful and those that benefit from it the most and have the most political influence in modern society. Nonetheless, modern individuals will have to deal increasingly with the innate contradictions and instability of the modern capitalist system the more it matures. I think a good example of this is the current Euro crisis and the social uprisings that have occurred in response to government austerity measures. Just last week we heard on the news about this retired pharmacist who was so caught up in debt and felt there was no future for him that he went and shot himself in front of a government building. And so I think the Occupy Wall Street movement may be another example of just the discontent that modern capitalism produces in society. So though it may be easy to sit back and predict capitalism's inevitable collapse, I think it appears that the other highly rationalized institutions in society are far too dependent upon capitalism and its mechanisms for production and things like that. And so thus it will do all that's possible to maintain it. However, I think it's fair to say it may look very different in the future than it currently manifests itself in society today. Just as Weber and Nietzsche predicted, it appears that this highly rationalized modern life is incredibly difficult to break free from. And for that reason, it seems that it will remain in modern society. I think the only feasible alternatives for such a highly rationalized modern society are more likely to originate from and manifest at the community level, which liberation theology and affirmative postmodernists proclaim. Liberation theology is unique, however, in the sense that it represents a revival of meaning from religion into the lives of modern people at the personal, communal, and institutional level. So it offers a deeper sense of meaning by marrying these religious beliefs with the struggle to empower human beings to create just structures and liberate the marginalized individuals to then lead this new society, those who've been most marginalized by modernity. The feminist critique of modern modes of knowledge and analysis can enable social theorists to rethink their approach to the study of society and social movements from the perspective of lived experiences and reality, which is thus empowering that postmodern concept of the local and the liberation theology concept of praxis. However, I think history has shown that attempts at such movements have largely been thwarted by institutional powers that promote and defend the status quo. So as a result, it's difficult to just sit back and predict that this is the alternative without also romanticizing the community and embracing a bit of idealism. Certainly, other potential alternatives to modernity lay in the future institutions and structures of the emerging world powers, such as China and India and possibly the Arab world. And in many respects, I think people are anxiously watching the Arab Spring to see if this mentality of protest for humanizing and just structures can be institutionalized and maintained in a way that's markedly different from the Western world. However, it appears, at least from the policies of China and India and possibly Egypt in the future, that they will continue to emphasize production and efficiency and growth just as much as Western modern capitalist societies, but perhaps maybe with different rules and processes and terminology. So, but nonetheless, in that case, rationalization will then remain into that next world order of power if that's the case. And plus, it's just far too early to predict what will come from the Arab Spring. Overall, until a strong, plausible alternative is developed, the iron cage appears to be just that, escape-proof. And it would appear that society cannot go back from modernity in the modern worldview, since it is so deeply penetrated into every other area of life. I think sadly modernity appears to have narrowed our minds and imaginations so much so that we struggle to even imagine other systems or alternatives outside of this modern capitalist, socialist, communist paradigm. And so, however, though, as Weber pointed out, if the future is still open and not deterministic, hope may still exist for a society that is structured in a way that provides a more meaningful life, particularly, I think, from the community level, and more particularly amongst communities that have been most marginalized by modernity. And until such an alternative is developed and manifested in reality, it appears that the iron cage is still the future of life in modern society. This quote I actually took from Dr. Zalongo when he was lecturing on Weber, and he said, I think this sums up very well, the future of modern society will not be the Garden of Eden, but an iron cage. And I think that gives a very big image for us. So overall, it is important to continue to engage in such a discourse as society moves forward in history, especially in light of the major social movements and global changes that are occurring. But nonetheless, to break free from the iron cage, it seems that for now, we will have to continue to look to the future for the key to our escape. Thank you. I don't know if there's any time for questions, but... Oh, perfect. I must have talked quickly.
I have two questions. When will postmodernity become postmodernity?
Okay.
What happens now?
That's I think what's funny is a lot of people who are strongly postmodernists will never identify as being postmodernists because then they're not postmodernists to their own standards. So I think some may, people who strongly embrace, especially skeptical postmodernism, they'll say that that label in and of itself is already wrong. So I think it depends on who you ask, but it's hard to imagine. I think postmodernism has mainly manifested at academia, at the academic level. There's not a lot of, we may begin to ask questions in a way that are more postmodern outside that rational modern framework, but I think it's hard to say what that would look like because it's still so much at an abstract level that it hasn't deeply penetrated into the average areas of life that we engage in. I don't know if that helps, but...
The other question is, I've read testimonies of people who have been abject Marxists or whatever, who have turned to the Bible and have read it sincerely and voluminously and have been transformed. I wonder if any of these guys, Nietzsche and Weber and Marx, ever really read the Bible.
I don't know, but I can tell you that at least Marx, I think, though Christians have been quick to just kind of get rid of him and brush him off, he is so deeply influenced by the Judeo-Christian view of life that it's hard to say that there's no overlap between the two. Even his vision of history has this kind of teleological, eschatological element to it where, we started here, we move forward, and then we're going to get to this end-all point, just as is the case with kind of the Christian eschatology. And that, I think, so in that way, he's been deeply influenced. And I think his move towards more just structures and things like that, I think he's very deeply influenced by Christianity, or Judeo-Christian values as a whole. I think, actually, Weber, especially, where sometimes American Christians have been quick to embrace him because of Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, I think he is the most condemning critique of what it means, how to work out being a Christian in modern life. I think he actually makes it so if you're a Christian, you should step back and go, well, how do we do this in this society? How do we begin to work out what it means to be human in social human beings in this context that's moving towards more individualism and efficiency and moving away from just experiencing human life. So, yeah, you're right. I don't know. I know that Marx was a self-identified atheist, and Nietzsche loved pre-Greek Empire, Greek Roman, or Greek religion, and Weber was kind of an agnostic Christian. But overall, I think Marx is the most deeply influenced by Judeo-Christian ideals and values.
There, a lot of us I mean, we're quite happy with, embedded in the capitalist system, and the fruits of scientific labors and so forth, and probably we're the beneficiaries, and we solve a lot of these problems with the patina of Christianity on top,
Yeah.
and we feel good at least once a week, so
Yeah.
some of us don't feel like there's any problem. We have a little bit of religion to solve some of the problems, serious problems that you raise,
Well, I think what's interesting, I think George Ritzer is a really good contemporary voice of Weber. And he pretty much says, most people are content to live within the iron cage and never even ask questions about it. Because it's nice, we can predict things. We know when we go into one McDonald's or the next, we know what it's going to be. And we know how we're going to get our food. And if it breaks outside of that, wow, we can take it to management. But I think it's only when you begin to rattle the cage of modernity that you realize how narrowing it is. And sometimes I really wish that I just simply didn't care about this and never ask questions. Because when you do, it really becomes almost haunting. But I think it's not, I don't think this is a left versus right or a Democrat versus Republican or capitalist socialist thing. These critiques apply across the board. And what it is just a critique of modern society. And so I think whether you have entirely socialist policies or entirely free market or anything in between, what you're still going to have within this modern rationalized framework is this thing that it's always shallowing our humanity in a way. And so if as Christians we are really claiming that, yeah, we are actually able to live out what it means to be fully human and make sure that other people are able to live life as being fully human and create just orders and really work that out in this world, man, modernity is really the antithetical framework within which we're battling against that. And so I think these are questions that should be asked, especially by Christians, because if we can't just blindly and naively think we can, we can just do church really well and things like that, and people will live out what it means to be Christian. How? If we're not addressing these, Dr. Zonga I love this metaphor he uses. He talks about how we have the hardware, that he uses computer metaphor. So as a brain and as sensing human beings, we have our hardware. But then how we understand and interpret things and the meanings behind them is through our software. And that's our modern lens. And so if we're approaching the Bible and the Christian church and the body of Christ in the world in the way in which it's all about efficiency and calculability, and can we get from A to B in the quickest way, and what benefits me the most, what gives me the most utility, man, I don't know. I feel like there's nothing more antithetical to the Bible than that, or to what it means to be Christian in this world today. So if we're letting that remain as the status quo and not being questioned in the church, we're losing our prophetic voice. Yeah.
Some people have to wander off to class, so you can hang around, and unless you have a class right away, you might want to come up, shoot your hand, ask
be
some
happy.
questions. But thank you very much for coming.